In the broken, ash-stained South of 1866, Eliza Hale has nothing left. No fortune, no father's legacy, and no future she can see from where she stands. When a Union general arrives in Savannah with iron authority and eyes that give nothing away, a contract is placed before her like a sentence. Marry him, keep his household in order, and ask nothing more. He made 5 rules. She agreed to survive. But rules written between two people who share the same walls, the same silences, and the same midnight storms have a dangerous way of dissolving, one broken promise at a time. General Nathaniel Caine never wanted a wife. He had built his life around not wanting things that could be taken from him. What he didn't expect was a woman who would refuse to disappear and who would, without asking permission, become the only thing worth staying for. This is not a love story that was planned. It is one that survived everything that tried to stop it. If this story already has you, subscribe, hit the bell, and tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Let's begin. The magnolias were still blooming when the war ended, but nobody in Savannah thought that was beautiful anymore. Eliza Hale stood at the upper window of Hale House, what remained of it, and watched the column of Union soldiers move down Bull Street like a river that had decided it owned the land. The azaleas along the iron fence had been trampled by boots months ago and never recovered. The fountain in the courtyard was dry. The house itself stood, which was more than could be said for most of the street, but it stood the way a widow stands at a graveside, upright, hollow, present only because it hadn't yet decided to fall. She pressed 2 fingers against the glass. The pain was cold despite the Georgia May heat pressing in from outside. Her breath fogged it slightly, a small living cloud that appeared and dissolved in seconds, the way so many things had lately. Her father's voice drifted up from downstairs, sharp and frantic, the way it had been for 6 months now, since the letter came from Richmond, since the last of their money dissolved into Confederate notes worth less than the paper they were printed on, since the creditors began arriving at the door with their hats in their hands, and their patience already gone. Eliza! Her mother appeared in the doorway behind her, wearing the same black dress she'd worn for 3 weeks. It had been washed twice. The grief had not washed out of it. Not the grey of it, not the weight of it, the specific tired darkness of a woman who has been mourning for so long. She has forgotten the shape of herself before the mourning began. Her posture was still correct. Her voice was still measured. But there were hairline fractures in her composure that hadn't been there before the war. Visible only at certain angles, in certain lights, like fine porcelain struck once too often. Come down. There is someone here. There is always someone here, Eliza said without turning from the window. Which creditor is it this time? It is not a creditor. Something in her mother's voice made Eliza turn. The man standing in the front parlor of Hale House did not look like a creditor. He looked like the war itself had sent a representative. General Nathaniel Caine was 34 years old, and he carried every one of those years in the lines around his eyes and the set of his jaw. He was tall, not theatrically so, but enough that the parlor's low ceiling felt lower with him inside it. His uniform was Union blue, immaculate, with the shoulder insignia of a brigadier general and a row of brass buttons that caught the late afternoon light without apology. He held his hat in one hand. He did not fidget with it. He stood in the center of the Hale family's faded oriental rug and looked at the room the way a man looks at a map, reading it, cataloging it, making quiet decisions about what was useful and what was not. His boots, she noticed, were polished to a mirror shine, not the shine of vanity, the shine of discipline, the shine of a man who controlled the things he could control because he had survived enough years of controlling nothing at all. When Eliza walked in, his eyes moved to her immediately, not with the slow assessing sweep that men typically used on young women, the kind that started at the hem and traveled upward like a tax assessment. It was faster than that, more precise, a soldier's glance, position, disposition, intent. He noted her the way he might note a terrain feature that would affect his next decision. She felt it land and straightened her spine in response, almost involuntarily. Her father stood near the window with his arms crossed, carrying the particular humiliation of a man who had once commanded rooms and now stood in his own parlor, feeling like a guest in it. "Eliza," Edmund Hale said, "this is General Caine. He has been appointed military governor of this district." A pause waited with something Edmund Hale didn't have the words for. "He has a proposition." "It is not a proposition," the general said. His voice was low and unhurried, with traces of Pennsylvania in it, vowels that were flat where southern vowels curved. "It is a formal offer, and Miss Hale is under no obligation to accept it." Eliza looked at the general. "Then tell me what it is." Her father made a sound in his throat. Protest or warning, she couldn't tell. But the general simply looked at her steadily, as if her directness were a language he found not only acceptable, but familiar. "I require a wife," he said. "Not in the romantic sense. I have been assigned to this district for 2 years, possibly 3. My superiors in Washington believe a married officer presents a more stable administrative face to the civilian population, particularly in this region, where tensions between former Confederate families and Union administration remain high." He paused. "In exchange, the debts against Hale House would be retired. Your family would retain the property. You would live as my wife in name and household management. Nothing more would be asked of you." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Eliza heard the dry fountain outside. She heard her mother's breath. She heard, somewhere in the house, the creak of a floorboard. The house itself listening, she thought, the way old houses listen when something is about to change. "Nothing more," she repeated. "I will set out the terms in writing," he said. "You have my word as an officer that they will be honored." She looked at him for a long moment. He met her gaze without shifting. Most men looked away from her when she held eye contact too long. He did not. He waited with the patience of a man who had learned that waiting cost less than rushing. "How many terms?" she asked. 5. "Tell me all 5 now, before I give you any answer." Her father inhaled sharply. Her mother remained a statue in the doorway. The general's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes shifted, something that might, in a different man, under different circumstances, have been called respect. "1," he said, "you will manage the household and appear at official functions as my wife. 2, you will not inquire into my work or my correspondence. 3, you will not attempt to access or communicate information about military operations in this district to former Confederate associates. 4, we will maintain separate chambers. 5, he paused, the first break in his cadence. You will not expect affection from me. I am not capable of offering it." The last rule landed differently than the others. Not harder, differently, like a stone dropped into still water with no splash, only rings spreading outward in silence. Eliza held his gaze for 3 more seconds. "I accept," she said, "on one condition." He raised an eyebrow, a fraction of an inch. She suspected for him that was considerable. "You will treat the household staff, all of them, including the freed people who remained, with the same respect you would show any civilian under your military protection." She did not blink. "That is not negotiable." The general was quiet for a moment. Then he said very simply, "Agreed." They signed the contract that evening, by candlelight, at her father's writing desk. The pen scratched across the paper with a sound like a small door closing. Outside, the magnolias continued their indifferent blooming, as if nothing had happened, as if this were not the beginning of everything. They were married on a Thursday. There was no celebration. A Union chaplain performed the ceremony in the Hale House parlor, with Eliza's parents as witnesses and 2 of the general's aides standing at attention near the door like decorative columns. Eliza wore her best remaining dress, a sage green silk that had survived the war by virtue of being buried in a cedar chest, and held a small cluster of white roses that Cora, the housekeeper, had cut from the garden that morning without being asked, without a word, simply placing them on Eliza's dressing table before dawn, with the practical tenderness of a woman who understood that some gestures could not be spoken. Nathaniel Caine said his vows with the same precision he might use to read orders. His voice did not waver. His eyes were on her face when he spoke them, which she found unexpected. She had assumed he would look somewhere neutral, somewhere non-committal, the way men looked when signing documents, but he looked directly at her, as if the words required a witness he had chosen deliberately. She said hers back, equally steady. Afterward there was tea. The general's aides left within the hour. Her parents retired upstairs with the particular weariness of people who have done something necessary that they cannot yet decide how to feel about, and Eliza found herself alone in the dining room with her husband, who was reading a sheaf of papers he had produced from inside his coat. his tea growing cold beside him. She sat across from him and poured herself a cup. "Do you always work at the table?" she asked. "Yes." "Then I will need a second lamp brought in. The light in here is insufficient." He looked up from his papers. "I don't require additional light." "I wasn't speaking about you," she said, and opened the book she had brought. He looked at her for a half-second longer than the sentence required. Then he looked back at his papers. They sat in silence for an hour. It was not, Eliza thought, an unpleasant silence. It was the silence of two people who had agreed on the shape of things and were quietly discovering whether the shape fit. The days that followed established their pattern with the efficiency of two disciplined people. General Caine left before dawn and returned at dusk. He ate dinner, sometimes at the table with Eliza, sometimes alone in his study, the choice seemingly determined by some internal calculation she hadn't yet decoded. He was not unkind. He said good morning when their paths crossed. He acknowledged her when she spoke to him. He answered questions directly and without embellishment. But he moved through the house like a man who had learned very early that attachment to places was a liability. And he had brought that lesson home with him, packed in alongside his commission papers and his dead brother's photograph. Eliza, for her part, set about restoring the house. Not for him. She was precise about this in her own mind, for herself, for the satisfaction of order being restored to something disordered, for the way purpose kept the hands busy, and the hands being busy kept the grief from settling in the joints. She and Cora reorganized the kitchen, catalogued what remained in the pantry, established a marketing schedule. She managed the household budget the General provided, more generous than the contract had specified, she noticed, though she did not remark on it, and sent word to the chandler, the seamstress, the dry goods merchant on Broughton Street. She began receiving visitors. This was where the education happened. The first time she walked into Mrs. Hargrove's shop to buy thread, the woman behind the counter, a widow herself, grey-haired, sharp-eyed, went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with concentration. A customer near the bolts of fabric turned to look at the window, suddenly very interested in the street outside. The conversation that had been running pleasantly through the room simply stopped, like a clock that had been grabbed mid-tick. Eliza set her money on the counter, stated her order clearly, and smiled with the particular steadiness of a woman who refuses to be made to feel small in a room she has every right to be in. She walked home 3 blocks with her spine straight and her face composed, and only when she reached the back garden did she let herself feel the weight of it, the cold shoulder of a community deciding who she was now, whether she was still one of them, whether survival on these particular terms was a thing they could forgive. She stood by the dry fountain for a moment. Then she went inside and wrote down the names of 12 women she intended to have to tea before the month was out. She understood. She was being measured. She intended to measure back. On the 14th night of their marriage, she found him in the garden at 10:30. She had come down for water and seen through the kitchen window the orange glow of a cigar moving near the old magnolia. She almost went back upstairs. Instead, she pushed open the back door and walked out into the warm Georgia dark, her shawl pulled around her shoulders against the faint night breeze. He heard her footsteps and turned slightly, not alarmed, just aware, the way he was always aware of everything within his perimeter. He had his coat off, the white of his shirt turned almost silver in the moonlight, the cigar held loosely at his side. "I didn't know you smoked," she said. "Only at night." She stood a few feet away and looked up at the magnolia. The blooms were enormous, waxy white against the dark sky, breathing their sweet, heavy scent into the air around them like something being exhaled. "My father planted this tree when I was born," she said. Not because it required saying, only because the night felt like a place where true things belonged. Nathaniel looked at the tree for a moment. "It survived the occupation," he said. "Yes, things do sometimes." He took a long, slow draw from the cigar, released the smoke into the dark. "Survive. Things you expect to lose." She looked at him. He was looking at the tree, or at something past it, something in the dark she didn't have the map for, something that lived on a road in Pennsylvania, or a field in Gettysburg, or in the particular silence that follows a telegram. "Was it very bad?" she asked quietly. "The war?" The question hung there between them. She half expected him to retreat behind Rule 2, "You will not inquire into my work." But the war was not his work anymore. It was over, or what passed for over. It lived in him the way it lived in everyone who'd been in it. Not as something that happened, but as something that stayed. Yes, he said. One word, but the weight behind it was considerable, the kind of weight that takes years to accumulate. They stood without speaking for several minutes more. The magnolia breathed above them. Somewhere down Bull Street a dog barked twice and went quiet. When Eliza finally said goodnight and turned toward the house, she was aware that something had shifted between them. Not dramatically, not with any announcement, quietly. The way the first crack appears in a winter river. You don't see water yet, but you feel the change in what's beneath your feet. 3 weeks into their marriage, General Caine broke Rule 2. Not her, she had not inquired. He had broken it himself, entirely inadvertently, in the way that small breaches in careful systems always begin. Not with intention, but with inattention. He left a report on the dining table. It was there when Eliza came down for breakfast, a sheaf of papers in his angular, economical handwriting, documenting 3 incidents of intimidation against freedmen attempting to register to vote. 1 burned schoolhouse. Unrest spreading through the southern parishes. She didn't read more than a paragraph before she turned the papers face down. But she had read enough to understand. This posting was not administrative pageantry. The violence hadn't ended with the surrender. It had simply changed its face and found new names for itself. When he returned that evening, she said nothing about the papers. They had been on the table when she came down, gone by the time she finished her coffee. But at dinner she said, "The Freedmen's School on Whitaker Street, the one that burned. What will happen to it?" He looked up. His eyes sharpened, not with suspicion, she thought, with recalibration. "It will be rebuilt," he said carefully, "if materials and protection can be arranged. I know someone who might organize the Women's Sewing Circle to raise funds," she said. "Former Confederate wives. They organized the hospital supply drive during the war. They know how to move money and materials when they believe in the cause." She met his eyes steadily. "They need to feel that it is their decision, not a union directive. People cooperate when they feel they own the choice." He was quiet for a moment, pressing 2 fingers lightly against his lips. A brief, private gesture, there and gone. "That is an astute assessment," he said finally. "It is an obvious one," she said, to anyone who has spent time actually listening to people. He looked at her again, and this time she caught something in his expression that she filed away carefully, not yet named, not yet claimed. Something that made the lines around his eyes less like armor and more like weather. The schoolhouse was rebuilt in 6 weeks. Eliza organized 3 fundraising teas, never once invoking the general's name or the military administration. She framed it as a community restoration, their community, their future, their choice. Women who had lost husbands and sons to the war brought fabric remnants and baked goods and gradually their cautious cooperation. He never mentioned it directly. But the following week the household budget increased without explanation, and there was a new lamp in the dining room. She was learning him. Not through inquiry, she honored that rule, at least in form, but through observation, through the patience of someone who has learned that people reveal themselves continuously to anyone willing to pay attention. He rose before dawn, always. She knew this from the smell of coffee that preceded him everywhere by 20 minutes. He ate simply. He had no vanity about his appearance, but was extraordinarily precise about his boots, which he cleaned himself every evening with a methodical care that had nothing to do with the boots and everything to do with the need to end each day with at least one thing in order. He had a habit, when thinking hard, of pressing 2 fingers to his lips. Just briefly, a small unconscious gesture she doubted he knew he made. She had begun to track it. It appeared when he was working through a problem that had more than one right answer. He read by the study fire for exactly 1 hour before the papers claimed him each night. He had 3 photographs on his desk, which she had glimpsed when delivering a letter. A woman she took for his mother, a Pennsylvania farmhouse in winter, and a young man in Union uniform who wore Nathaniel's jaw and someone else's lightness, the kind of lightness that belongs to people who have not yet learned that the world takes things. She didn't ask about the photographs, but she thought about the young soldier often, and about what it does to a person to come home from a war carrying a name that used to answer back. The first formal dinner came in the 5th week. District officials, their wives, former Confederate landowners who had signed the loyalty oath and were being carefully reintegrated, a room full of people who needed to be in the same space without the space catching fire. Eliza planned the menu with Cora, arranged the table, briefed the staff, and then put on her green silk dress and became, for the evening, precisely what the contract had hired her to be. She was the hostess the room required. She laughed at the right moments, listened with the full weight of her attention when listening was called for, steered conversation away from fault lines with the lightness of someone rerouting a stream before it becomes a flood. She made a former Confederate colonel and a Union adjutant discover they had both read the same Dickens novel. She had not read it herself, but she had read enough of everything to build a bridge out of almost any two people's bookshelves. Nathaniel sat at the head of the table and did what he did at that table, performed the authority they needed him to have, held the room's respect, said exactly what was necessary and nothing more. But she caught it twice, his gaze on her across the candle-lit length of the table. Not a general's assessment, something slower than that, something that followed her the way attention follows a thing it hasn't yet decided what to call. When the guests were gone and the house had settled back into its nighttime quiet, he found her in the parlor with her shoes off and her head tilted back against the chair, eyes closed. She heard his footsteps and opened hers. "You are very good at that," he said. "At what? Making people comfortable. Even people who arrive determined not to be." She considered this. "My mother called it the most important skill a Southern woman could have." She paused. "I used to think it was a small thing, a decorative thing. I understand now it is a form of power." He stood in the doorway, still in his uniform, one hand on the frame. The look on his face was new. She didn't have it catalogued yet. Not the general's look, something underneath it, something that had been watching her all evening and had finally stopped pretending it was doing something else. "Thank you," he said, "for tonight." 3 words, straightforward, unremarkable. But the way they came out, at a small cost to him, with a quietness that wasn't his usual economy but something else, something offered, made them land in a place they had no business landing in. "Good night, General," she said. He nodded. He left. She sat alone in the dark parlor for a long time after that, her heart conducting itself in ways entirely outside the terms of their written agreement. Rule 5. You will not expect affection from me. I am not capable of offering it. He broke it on a Tuesday in the rain. It was the heavy, unrelenting Georgia summer rain that turned streets to rivers and pressed itself against every window like something trying to get in. Eliza had planned to visit the school to check on the roof repairs. Instead, she was stranded in the house with a novel she'd already read twice and a restlessness she had no clean name for. She heard him come in at midday, an unusual. He rarely returned before dusk. And then almost immediately heard raised voices from the study. 2 of his aides. She was not listening deliberately, but Hale House was old, and the rain was loud, and the words reached her in pieces. "Ambush, Whitaker Road, 2 soldiers down. The 3rd one isn't expected to last the night." Then silence. Then the sound of a single fist against a desk. She put her book down. She went to the kitchen and told Cora to make coffee. Strong the way he took it, no sugar. She stood outside the study door with her hand raised. She knocked. "Leave it," he said. His voice was flat in the particular way of a man pressing down hard on something that wants to surface. "It's not your aid," she said. A silence. Then, "Come in." He was at the window, his back to her, hands clasped behind him. The desk had papers spread across it and a map that had been folded and unfolded so many times its creases had gone soft. She set the coffee on the corner of the desk without ceremony. She didn't leave. "Eliza," her name, controlled, precise. "This is not something you should—" "I'm not asking about the work," she said. "I heard voices. You came home at noon. I'm not asking about the operation or the orders or any of it." She paused. "I'm asking if you would like company. That is a different thing entirely." The rain drove itself against the window glass. He didn't move. Then very slowly, he turned. His face was bummed, not broken. Not quite. But the architecture of it had shifted. The general was there, yes. The structure of him, the held-together discipline of a man who had been holding things together for years by sheer force of will. But behind the general, visible now in the grey afternoon light in a way it had never been before, was the man underneath. Exhausted in the bone-deep way of someone who has been tired for so long they have forgotten what rest felt like, carrying something too heavy to put down, standing in a borrowed house in a city that wasn't his, in a marriage that wasn't what marriages were supposed to be, trying to hold a fractured country together with orders and regulations and 5 written rules. He looked at her for a long time. Then he sat, and not at the desk, but in the reading chair beside the window, the one he used in the evenings, and picked up the coffee. He said nothing. He didn't ask her to leave. She took the chair across from him and opened her book, and for 2 hours they sat in the rain-grey light of the study without speaking, just present. Just in the same room, breathing the same air, while the rain made its argument against the windows and the district went on breaking and rebuilding itself outside. When the rain finally slowed and the light changed, he stood and buttoned his coat. In the doorway, without turning back, "Thank you." The same 2 words as after the dinner party. They didn't sound the same at all. It grew slowly, the way things grow when no one has given them permission. It grew in the mornings, when she began leaving his coffee on his study desk before he arrived at it, and he began arriving earlier because the coffee was there. It grew in the evenings, when the after-dinner silence lengthened and became less an absence of conversation and more a presence of its own, the kind of quiet that takes weeks to build and means something different from ordinary quiet. So it grew in the garden. 2 nights a week, reliably, she found him there near the magnolia tree with his cigar and whatever the day had left him with. She had begun bringing her shawl. He had stopped walking away when she appeared. Then he had stopped walking away before she appeared, already on the bench, already waiting, though neither of them used that word. She told him about her childhood in that garden. The summer she climbed the iron fence on a dare she had made with herself and came home with palms torn open and told her mother she'd fallen from a horse. Her mother had pressed clean cloth to her hands and looked at her with eyes that knew perfectly well, but she had allowed the lie, because the torn palms meant the adventure had been necessary, and mothers who understand their daughters know when not to ask. He listened the way he listened to everything, completely with his full attention, giving each word the weight it earned. One night, he told her about Pennsylvania. He released it in pieces carefully, the way a man releases something he's been carrying alone for a long time and is not entirely sure it's safe to put down. 30 acres of wheat land. A creek that froze solid in winter and came back every spring with a sound like breaking glass. A father who was quiet and serious and expressed love through maintenance, through the careful daily act of keeping things from falling apart, which was, Nathaniel said slowly, the only language of love he had been taught as a boy. And then his brother, James, 2 years younger, lighter, better with horses than with anything requiring patience, which meant better with most living things than Nathaniel was, the first of them to enlist. He told her how it ended with the same economy he used for everything, stripped down to fact, voice level, eyes on the dark, beyond the garden fence. Gettysburg, July 2nd, 1863. He had been 4 miles away when it happened. He had not found out until the following morning. She sat with this. She did not reach for comfort or condolence. She had enough sense to understand that wasn't what the moment called for. She sat with him in it, the way she had sat with him in the study during the rain, present still, not trying to repair the irreparable. After a long silence, she said, "He would have liked Savannah in spring." Nathaniel looked at her. "The air here," she said, "it gets into you before you realize it has. The kind of place that's hard to leave once the season turns." She paused. The kind of person who's good with living things usually feels it. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, very softly, almost only to himself, yes, he would have. The night of the second formal reception, a congressional aide from Washington, young, comfortable in his own authority, the kind of man who had never been inconvenienced by his own opinions, made a remark to Eliza about Southern women. It was calibrated to land softly enough that most of the room would miss it, but sharply enough that she would feel it. She stood very still for a half-second, the way she went still when she was choosing between strategy and directness. She had begun choosing strategy when Nathaniel appeared at her side. He said nothing to the aide. He placed his hand on the small of her back, the first time he had ever touched her, in any room for any reason, and addressed the aide directly about an unrelated administrative matter, with the full weight of his rank, redirecting the entire room's attention without acknowledging that anything had needed redirecting. His hand remained on her back. She was aware of it with an attention that had nothing to do with strategy. She was aware of the warmth of it, through the layers of her dress, the steadiness of it, the deliberateness of it, the fact that it had not been accidental, and both of them knew it. In the carriage home, his hand was gone, and the seat between them was exactly the width the contract specified. Neither spoke. Outside the carriage window, Savannah passed in its nighttime version. Gas lamps on the squares, the Spanish moss moving in the faint breeze, the city breathing. She looked out her window. He looked out his. And the space between them on the seat was somehow fuller than it had ever been when it was simply empty. It happened on a Thursday, exactly 3 months after they had signed the contract on one. The district had sharpened into something more dangerous. The organized resistance to Reconstruction, the voter intimidation, the targeted violence had escalated in the 2 weeks prior. She had not been given details. She had gathered enough from overheard fragments and the set of his shoulders when he returned at night to understand the shape of it. He came home past midnight. She was awake. She had been awake for 2 hours, lying in her separate chamber in the dark, listening to the house the way she had listened to it as a girl during thunderstorms, tracking its sounds, waiting for the one that meant something. She heard his boots on the stairs. She heard them stop outside her door. She lay still. 15 seconds. She counted without meaning to. Then his footsteps continued down the hall to his own chamber. She sat up in the dark. She put her feet on the floor. She put on her robe. She walked to his door and knocked once. Nathaniel. A pause. It's late. I know. Another pause. Are you all right? I was going to ask you the same thing. The door opened. He was still in his uniform, coat half unbuttoned, hair disordered in the way it got when he'd been running his hand through it, which was his one clear tell, the one crack in the architecture. He looked at her in the lamplight with the expression she recognized now. The general stepping back, the man beneath him visible and unguarded in the amber light. I'm fine, he said. She looked at him steadily. You stood outside my door for 15 seconds. You don't do anything without reason. He looked at her for a moment. Something moved through his face. The resistance of a man who has been self-sufficient for so long that being known by someone feels like a small, disorienting miracle. I didn't want to wake you, he said. I wasn't asleep. I know, he said quietly. I could tell. The admission hung between them, that he knew the sound of her sleep, which meant he knew the sound of her awake, which meant he had been paying that kind of close, involuntary attention to her for 3 months. She stepped into the room, he told her. 3 freedmen who had organized voter registration attacked on the Whitaker Road. 1 dead. The district on the edge of something that could become generalized violence, and he was 30 men and 1 political mandate against an organized resistance with the sympathy of half the local judiciary and the silence of people who should have spoken. She listened without interrupting. She sat on the low ottoman by the dying fire and held his words the way you hold something fragile, carefully, with both hands, without trying to reshape it. When he finished, she said, You cannot hold the whole district, but you can hold the ground in front of you. She paused. My father said that about the farm, about almost everything. The ground in front of you. That's the one that matters. He looked at her across the firelight. Eliza, he said, and her name in his mouth was different now. Not controlled, not precise, raw and unguarded, like something that had been waiting for exactly this length of time to be said aloud. I am aware, he said slowly, that I am in violation of the last term. She didn't look away. Which part of it? The part where I told you I was not capable. He met her eyes. I was wrong. I was trying to protect you from something I believed I would only damage. I had very good reasons for believing that. A pause. I am not certain anymore that good reasons make a thing true. They don't, she said quietly, and I am not something that breaks. He looked at her for a long time. The fire breathed down to embers between them. Outside, the Georgia night was very still. No, he said softly. You are not. He moved from his chair and crossed the space between them, not quickly, not hesitantly, but with the deliberateness of a man who has made a decision and is not taking it back. And he took her hand, both of his hands around hers. Warm, calloused, entirely certain, the way he was certain about everything once he had decided. She felt the warmth of it move through her, like the first decent breath after a long time of breathing shallowly. They stayed like that for a long moment, her hand in both of his, the fire dying quietly, the night holding still around them. Then he looked at her face, her actual face, every part of it, the way he'd been not looking at it for 3 months, and she looked back at him with the full weight of everything she had been not saying, and the space between them simply closed. He kissed her with the care of a man who has waited so long for something that he intends to do it right. Not rushed, not tentative either. Certain, the way he was certain about the things that mattered, with both hands and full attention, the way he did everything once he had decided it was worth doing. She kissed him back the way a woman kisses a man she has been watching for 3 months and has wanted, quietly and stubbornly and without permission, for most of them. When they finally pulled back, it was not far, his forehead against hers, both of them breathing, both of them aware in the same moment that something had just become irreversible. The contract, she said quietly, against the small space between them. I know. We'll need new terms. She felt the almost smile happen against her temple, the one that had been there for 3 months in partial form, showing itself only in fractions. It was the first time she had felt it, rather than seen it. Tomorrow, he said. Tonight I'd rather just stay, she said. Yes, he said that. Spring came back to Savannah the following April with the extravagance of a city that had decided, despite everything, to live again. The tulip trees bloomed along Forsyth Park. The market carried goods that hadn't appeared on shelves in years. The Freedmen's School on Whitaker Street, the rebuilt one, the one Eliza had organized through 3 carefully managed teas and 12 women who had needed to feel the choice was theirs, was full every morning, voices drifting out through its repaired windows and into the street like something that had been a long time coming. General Caine stood at the window of his office on Bay Street and watched the square below. Freedmen and white citizens moving through the same market in the same morning, not without friction, not without the weight of everything that had brought them here, but moving, existing in the same air. That was not a small thing. In 1866 it had seemed impossible. Now it was simply Tuesday. It was not victory, but it was not nothing. In February, he had done something his superiors had not anticipated. He requested a permanent posting in Savannah. The letter required 3 drafts. The first 2 were too formal, the language of orders, of administrative efficiency. The third was honest, which made it harder to write and easier to send. He cited ongoing district needs, civilian military stability under his command. Both of these things were true. What he did not write, because it was not the kind of thing written in official correspondence, was this: I have a wife who rebuilt a schoolhouse through sheer social engineering and made former enemies drink tea together. I have a house with a magnolia tree in the garden where we sit on Tuesday and Thursday evenings and talk about things that matter. I have someone who knocked on my door at midnight and sat with me through the worst of it and did not flinch. I have something I did not expect. I intend to stay. Washington approved the request in March. He told Eliza at dinner. She looked up from her plate and something moved across her face, quick and bright, and then contained, the way she contained things she felt strongly about before she decided whether to let them be visible. Permanent, she said. Permanent, he said. She looked back down at her plate. He could see her working to hold her expression level. He had learned to read the work. The original contract, she said carefully, was written for a 2-year posting. Yes, he said, if the posting is extended, Eliza. He waited until she looked at him. I would like to renegotiate the contract. The corner of her mouth moved. Just slightly, just enough. I have conditions, she said. I expected nothing less. The household staff retains their positions and wages regardless of any future military reassignment. Done. But you tell me when something is wrong. You don't stand outside my door for 15 seconds and walk away. He felt his chest do something he had stopped trying to explain or contain. Done. And you stop calling yourself incapable of things, she said, her voice quieter now, when the evidence has been plainly to the contrary for quite some time. He looked at her steadily across the table. The dining room table, the lamp she had insisted on the first night, the faded rug that had survived a war. He looked at her the way he had learned to look at her, directly, completely, with nothing held back. Done, he said, softly. She reached across the table, past the plates and the glasses and the architecture of an ordinary dinner, and put her hand over his. He turned his hand over and held it. His thumb moved once across her knuckles, unhurried, like he had time now, like time was a thing he had come to believe in again. They married again in April. Not officially, The contract was legal, the marriage recorded. But on a Sunday morning in the garden, with Cora pretending very hard to be interested in the kitchen window and the magnolia tree in full bloom overhead, Nathaniel Caine said things to his wife that had not been in any document. He was not eloquent. He did not try for eloquence. It wasn't his language, and they both knew it. He was precise the way he was precise about everything, and that precision turned out to be its own kind of beautiful. He said, "I built the rules because I had learned that anything I allowed myself to want could be taken. James, the farm, the version of the future I had planned before 1861, made planning feel foolish." He paused. "You did not stay at a safe distance. You came through every wall I built, and you never once made me feel diminished for having built them." She looked up at him, at the general's face, the man's face, the face that had learned, over one long year, to let itself be seen. "Tell me your condition," she said. "You always have one." The almost smile arrived. "All the way this time." "Stay," he said. "Not because a document says so, because you choose to. Every morning, for as long as you're willing." She took his face in both her hands, the face she had been studying for a year, every line of it, every guarded expression and its translation. And she said, "Nathaniel Caine, I have been choosing this since the night you stood in my garden and told me that things survive." He kissed her under the magnolia, with spring pressing in from all directions, and the school children's voices drifting from down the street, and the whole broken, rebuilding, almost beautiful world going on around them, without caring at all that two people in a garden had just decided, very quietly, to be happy. 5 years later, 1871, the fountain in the courtyard ran again. Nathaniel had arranged it quietly, as a birthday gift. He had said nothing about it until the morning Eliza walked outside and heard the water, a sound she hadn't heard since she was 11 years old, and stopped in the middle of the path. She stood there for a full minute, her hands at her sides, looking at the water that had no right to be there, and was there anyway. She turned around. He was in the kitchen doorway with his coffee, watching her with the expression that had stopped trying to be the general's expression and was simply his. She crossed the courtyard and walked into him, and he held her the way he held everything he valued, completely, with both arms, with full attention. The school on Whitaker Street was now the Whitaker Community Hall. Expanded twice, serving 300 families. There was a lending library that had been Eliza's specific project, assembled over 3 years through donations, estate sales, and a letter-writing campaign she had conducted entirely on her own initiative. There was a Wednesday evening class for adult literacy that she taught herself on alternate weeks. On those evenings, Nathaniel always had dinner waiting when she returned, never announced, simply there. He had been promoted to Major General. He had twice been offered a political appointment in Washington and had twice declined, with the unhurried courtesy of a man who knows exactly where he is supposed to be and finds it sufficient. His study desk still had 3 photographs. Now there was a 4th. Eliza in the garden, looking up at something above the frame, her expression open in the way it went when she was thinking about something she hadn't decided whether to say yet. He had commissioned a photographer without telling her. She had found the photograph on his desk a week after it appeared and stood looking at it for a moment. "That is a terrible angle," she said. "I think it is perfect," he said without looking up from his papers. "You are biased." "Extensively and without apology," he said. On the 5th anniversary of the day they signed the contract, she sat at the parlor writing desk with a piece of paper and her good pen. He came in and leaned against the doorframe and watched her. "What are you writing?" he asked. She looked up. The smile arrived the way it always did with him. Not deployed, not managed, simply there. "New terms," she said. He crossed the room and stood behind her and read over her shoulder. "Term 1, he will always come home. Term 2, she will always leave the light on. Term 3, the garden belongs to both of them. Term 4, grief is allowed, silence is allowed. Neither of them has to pretend. Term 5, this is not a contract, this is a choice, made every morning, renewed every evening, until further notice." He read it twice. Then he reached past her, picked up the pen, dipped it, and signed his name beneath hers without a word. She looked at his signature next to hers on the page, his handwriting angular, economical, entirely itself. Hers clear and deliberate, entirely herself. 2 different hands, the same page. Outside, the fountain ran. The magnolia was in bloom. Down the street, a child was learning to read in a building that had been burned down and rebuilt and burned again in the heart of one man who had decided it mattered enough to protect. The South was still broken in 100 ways. The work was unfinished, dangerous, requiring everything they had. But in the house on Bull Street, in the lamplight, in the garden, in the renewed quiet of a home that had been a transaction and become a life, something had been built that no one had planned for. Only chosen. Every morning, without further contract required.
The war was written on your skin, in every line you tried to hide. And I had nothing left to give, just empty rooms and broken pride. You built your walls with steady hands. I learned to live without a name. Two strangers standing in the dark with nothing left but just the same. We never planned this, we never dreamed, but something found us in between. We chose this life when nothing was certain. Through all the nights, behind every curtain, no promises made, no fairy tale stars, but somewhere between the silence, you found my heart. You said you couldn't feel a thing, that love was something left behind. But even steel begins to bend when it's held long enough in time. And I was never meant to stay, not in a house like this, not here. But somehow every step away just pulled me closer, year by year. You didn't save me, you let me stand. And that's the moment you took my hand. We chose this life when nothing was certain. Through all the nights, behind every curtain, no promises made, no perfect design, but somewhere between your broken world and mine. If tomorrow breaks like yesterday did, we'll still be here, we'll still exist. Not because we have to, but because we stayed. We chose this life through fire and distance, through every fight and quiet resistance. No contract now, no rules to defend, just something real. We choose again and again. The war is over, but we remain. Not what we were, but something